These 15 seconds look like a routine arrest, but they destroyed one career and set off a chain of events no one expected, because the officer shouting those commands had no idea who he had just detained. It was an ordinary afternoon in a modern American city, the kind of day that doesn't register as important while it's happening. Traffic moved through the streets at its usual pace. People walked in and out of buildings without paying attention to anyone around them, and the city functioned the way it always does, quietly, routinely, predictably. Nothing in the air suggested danger. Nothing felt tense. Nothing felt unstable. It was just another normal day in a place where thousands of ordinary moments pass without meaning or memory. On a quiet section of the street, a black man in his late 30s stood near his car on the sidewalk. He was dressed in plain civilian clothes, carrying nothing unusual, wearing no uniform, no symbols, no identifiers of any kind. There was nothing about him that marked him as important, powerful, or significant. He wasn't speaking loudly. He wasn't arguing with anyone. He wasn't causing a disturbance. He wasn't attracting attention. He was simply there, standing near his vehicle, existing in the space like anyone else in the city. People passed by without looking at him. Cars drove past without slowing down. The environment treated him as invisible, the same way cities treat most people most of the time. Nothing about the scene suggested conflict. Nothing suggested confrontation. Nothing suggested that this moment would become part of a recorded incident that would later be analyzed, replayed, and dissected by strangers who had never been there. A few blocks away, a patrol unit was moving through its routine route. Another shift, another day, another set of streets to cover. Inside the vehicle was an officer who had done this hundreds of times before, responding to calls, making stops, approaching people, asserting authority. It was a system he knew well and a role he was comfortable in. He didn't see himself as part of a larger story. He didn't think in terms of consequences or patterns. He thought in terms of control, compliance, and command. When the call came in, it didn't sound urgent. There was no report of violence, no report of a weapon, no report of an active crime, no emergency language, no panic in the dispatcher's voice. Just a brief description delivered in the neutral tone of routine communication. Suspicious male near a vehicle. That was all. No explanation, no context, no details. Just one word that carried enough weight on its own. Suspicious. It wasn't a description of behavior. It wasn't a description of danger. It wasn't a description of a crime. It wasn't evidence of anything specific, but it was enough to trigger a response, enough to justify intervention, enough to initiate contact, enough to turn an ordinary moment into a police encounter. The officer didn't ask follow-up questions. He didn't request clarification. He didn't ask what the man was doing, how long he had been there, or whether anyone had been threatened. He didn't slow the process down. He didn't consider alternative explanations. He accepted the framing of the call as sufficient. By the time he turned toward the location, the narrative had already formed in his mind. Not from evidence, not from facts, not from observation, but from assumption. Someone was out of place. Someone didn't belong. Someone needed to be confronted. The man standing next to his car had no way of knowing any of this. He didn't hear the radio call. He didn't hear the description. He didn't hear the word suspicious. He didn't know that a patrol unit had already decided to engage him. He didn't know that his ordinary day had already been reframed into something else. He was still just standing there, unaware that a routine moment in an ordinary city was about to become the beginning of a story that would reshape multiple lives, not because of what he did, but because of how he was seen. The patrol car turned onto the street without urgency, its presence blending into the normal rhythm of the city. There were no sirens, no dramatic arrival, no visible panic, just a police vehicle slowing as it approached the man standing near his car. From the outside, the moment looked routine, almost unremarkable. Another officer, another stop, another interaction that would normally pass without consequence or memory. But the mindset inside the vehicle was already set. The officer didn't arrive to observe. He didn't arrive to assess. He didn't arrive to gather information. He arrived with a conclusion. The description he had received, suspicious male near a vehicle, had already framed the situation as a problem to be managed, not a question to be answered. There was no curiosity, no uncertainty, no openness to interpretation. The encounter was already defined before it began. As the officer stepped out of the patrol car, his posture was rigid, controlled, and assertive. His hand rested close to his belt, his body language communicating authority and command before a single word was spoken. He moved directly toward the man, closing the distance quickly, not creating space for conversation, not allowing room for explanation. The black man near the car turned as he noticed the approach. There was no attempt to flee, no sudden movement, no sign of panic, no defensive posture. He simply looked up, registering the presence of law enforcement in front of him, expecting what most people expect in that moment: a question, a request, some form of explanation. That's not what came. The first words weren't neutral. They weren't calm. They weren't investigative. They were commands, sharp, direct, authoritative, the kind of tone designed to establish control immediately, not communication. The man tried to speak, to understand what was happening, to ask why he was being confronted, but the space for dialogue never opened. The officer's voice dominated the interaction from the first second, cutting through any attempt at conversation. This wasn't an exchange, it was a directive. The situation escalated almost instantly, not because of resistance, not because of aggression, not because of threat, but because of momentum. Once authority is asserted in that way, the interaction stops being about facts and starts being about compliance. Bystanders began to slow their steps. A few people turned their heads. Someone across the street paused. Nothing dramatic yet, just the subtle shift that happens when public space senses tension. The man's confusion became visible. Not fear, not anger, confusion. The kind that comes when a normal moment suddenly becomes something else without explanation. He wasn't arguing. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't challenging authority. He was trying to understand why he was being treated like a problem, but understanding was never the goal of the encounter. Control was. As the officer closed the distance, the interaction lost its last trace of neutrality. Physical proximity replaced conversation. Commands replaced questions. Movement replaced dialogue. The camera captured the shift, the tightening space, the sudden instability, the loss of framing, the body cam shaking as the encounter turned physical. Hands entered the frame, the horizon tilted, the sidewalk filled the camera view, the soundscape changed, breathing became louder, voices overlapped, the radio crackled, footsteps hit the pavement in rapid rhythm. What had started as a routine contact became a detention in seconds. Not because of a crime, not because of evidence, not because of a threat, but because once the encounter moved past conversation, there was no path back to neutrality. In public view, in open daylight, in the middle of an ordinary city street, the man was forced into a position of compliance while people around him tried to understand what they were witnessing. Some slowed down, some stopped, some reached for their phones, others just watched, unsure whether what they were seeing was normal procedure or something else entirely. From the outside, it looked like authority being exercised. From the inside, it felt like control being imposed. And the moment the handcuffs came into play, the encounter crossed a line that would define everything that followed. Because from that point forward, the narrative would no longer be about what happened before the officer arrived. It would be about what happened next. By the time the handcuffs were applied, the encounter had stopped being a private interaction between two people and had become a public event. The sidewalk was no longer just a piece of city infrastructure. It had turned into a stage. The street was no longer just a street. It had become an audience space. What was happening was no longer contained. It was visible exposed and unfolding in front of strangers who had no context, no background, and no explanation for what they were witnessing. The man was on the ground now, restrained, confused, and surrounded by authority he did not understand. His face showed disbelief more than fear, shock more than anger. This wasn't the expression of someone who expected conflict. It was the expression of someone trying to process how an ordinary moment had transformed into a public detention in a matter of seconds. The body cam captured everything: the unstable framing, the shifting angles, the flashes of light, the chaotic movement. Knees on concrete, asphalt filling the frame, the distorted perspective of a camera too close to the ground, the sound of breathing growing heavier, voices overlapping, radio chatter bleeding into shouted commands, the metallic click of handcuffs cutting through the noise. Around them, the city slowed. People stopped walking, cars slowed down, heads turned, eyes fixed on the scene. Some bystanders stood at a distance, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. Others instinctively reached for their phones, not out of heroism, not out of activism, but out of a basic human reaction to something that feels wrong and unresolved. The kind of moment people record because they don't trust their memory to be enough. There were voices from the crowd now, not loud, not aggressive, not confrontational, just confused. Questions without answers, concern without authority, witnesses without power. What's happening? Why is he on the ground? What did he do? No one could answer them. The officer didn't address the crowd. He didn't explain the situation. He didn't provide context. He didn't justify the detention. The scene operated on a single principle: control, not clarity. Every movement reinforced it. Every command reinforced it. Every physical action reinforced it. The man tried to speak, to explain, to ask what he was being detained for, but his voice was swallowed by the noise of the moment, by the authority of the situation, by the structure of the encounter itself. Once a person is on the ground in handcuffs, their voice loses legitimacy in the eyes of the system. Their words stop being information and start being treated as noise. This was no longer about investigation. It was no longer about suspicion. It was no longer about a call for service. It was about narrative control. From the outside, the image was simple: a man in handcuffs, an officer in uniform, authority being exercised. For many observers, that image alone carries an assumption of guilt, even without evidence, even without explanation, even without context. The visual hierarchy does the work that logic doesn't. Uniform, badge, weapon, handcuffs. The symbols speak louder than facts. And in that moment, the story was being written in real time, not by evidence, not by investigation, not by law, but by optics. The man on the ground was no longer seen as a person standing by his car. He was now a detainee. The officer was no longer a responder. He was now control. Roles had been assigned, and those roles would shape how every second that followed would be interpreted, recorded, remembered, and later judged. What no one in that crowd knew, what no one watching from the sidewalk could have known, was that this scene was only the surface layer of the story, that what they were witnessing was not the core conflict, but the beginning of something much larger. Because the identity of the man in handcuffs would soon change the meaning of everything that had just happened. And the moment that identity came into the open, the narrative would no longer belong to the officer, the camera, or the street. It would belong to the truth. The turning point of the incident did not come through force or escalation, and it did not come from the crowd, the noise, or the growing tension surrounding the scene. It came quietly, almost invisibly, through information rather than action. In the middle of the confusion, with voices overlapping and movement still unsettled, the man in handcuffs began to speak in a calm, controlled tone that stood in sharp contrast to the chaos around him. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He did not posture. He did not attempt to dominate the situation. Instead, he identified himself in the simplest possible way, explaining that he had served in law enforcement, that he had worn the uniform, and that he had operated inside the same system that was now restraining him. He did not frame it as leverage, and he did not present it as a challenge. He stated it as fact, plainly and without emotion, as someone who understood the weight of the words without needing to dramatize them. The effect of that revelation was not loud, but it was immediate. The atmosphere of the encounter shifted, not in a way that the crowd could easily perceive, but in a way that altered the internal structure of the interaction itself. In systems built on hierarchy and control, authority depends on asymmetry. On one side, possessing knowledge, power, and procedural command, and the other side being positioned as uninformed, subordinate, and dependent. The moment that asymmetry collapses, the logic of control begins to fracture. The officer hesitated. It was not a dramatic pause, and it was not a visible breakdown of authority, but it was a disruption in rhythm, a subtle change in posture, a slight slowing of movement, a recalibration of distance. The automatic certainty that had defined the encounter from the first moment of contact was no longer absolute. The situation had entered unfamiliar territory. This was no longer a simple civilian encounter. The man on the ground was no longer just a detainee or a subject of control. He was someone who understood the system's language, its procedures, its internal logic, and its operational boundaries. He spoke not in the language of outrage, but in the language of policy. He referenced protocol rather than injustice, process rather than emotion, structure rather than protest. His words were precise, measured, and procedural, not reactive. That precision mattered more than volume ever could. Systems are not destabilized by anger. They are destabilized by understanding. They are not threatened by chaos. They are threatened by clarity. Emotion can be ignored, dismissed, or overpowered. Knowledge cannot be as easily neutralized. The crowd could not hear the significance of the exchange. The bystanders saw only fragments of conversation and movement. The cameras captured sound but not meaning. To anyone watching from the outside, it looked like another routine police interaction unfolding in public space. But beneath the surface, the encounter had already transformed. It was no longer about suspicion. It was no longer about presence. It was no longer about a call for service. It had become a moment of internal contradiction, the system encountering someone who understood it well enough to expose its flaws from within. And when institutions face that kind of contradiction, they do not respond with empathy, and they do not respond with humility. They respond with self-preservation. The real consequences of the incident did not unfold in the street, and they did not happen in front of cameras, crowds, or witnesses. They unfolded quietly, through systems, processes, and structures that operate far from public view. Like most institutional responses, what followed was not dramatic, emotional, or theatrical. It was procedural. It was administrative. It was controlled. The kind of response that happens in offices, review rooms, and internal channels, not on sidewalks and city streets. The body cam footage was logged into evidence systems. Radio transmissions were archived. Reports were written, reviewed, and cross-checked. Witness videos were collected and cataloged. Timelines were reconstructed. Statements were compared against recordings. What had felt like a chaotic confrontation in real time was reduced to data, frames, timestamps, transcripts, and documentation. Once the incident entered that phase, the narrative changed. It was no longer defined by perception, emotion, or public reaction. It became a matter of liability, procedure, and exposure. The question was no longer whether the interaction felt wrong. The question became whether it could be justified within policy. Every decision was examined through that lens. The officer's approach was analyzed against protocol. The escalation was measured against procedure. The justification for the detention was evaluated against departmental standards. The language used in reports was compared to what the footage actually showed. What emerged was not a single mistake, but a sequence of decisions that could not be easily defended as routine. The system did not frame this as a moral failure or an ethical collapse. Institutions rarely do. It framed it as risk. And systems respond to risk with containment. The process that followed was quiet, structured, and internal. Reviews moved through administrative channels. Supervisors assessed exposure. Legal departments evaluated liability. Risk profiles were created. The focus was not on justice in a moral sense, but on stability in an institutional sense. The question was no longer, was this right? The question became, can this officer remain in the system without creating future risk? Because institutions do not operate primarily on morality. They operate on functionality. When a person becomes a credibility problem, a liability issue, or a procedural risk, the system does not interpret that as injustice. It interprets it as dysfunction. And dysfunctional components are not punished. They are removed, not as an act of accountability, not as a statement of ethics, not as a public admission of wrongdoing, but as a method of risk management. The consequences did not come with spectacle. They came with silence, with paperwork, with internal decisions that never reach the public in full detail. Careers do not always end in courtrooms or headlines. Sometimes they end in administrative files and quiet separations that leave no visible trace in the public record. What the public saw was a video. What the system saw was a risk profile. What witnesses experienced was a moment of public detention. What the institution processed was exposure. And the man who had been standing next to his car on an ordinary day became the catalyst for a chain of events he never intended to trigger. Not because of a crime, not because of a threat, and not because of violence, but because a system built on control encountered someone who understood it well enough to challenge its structure from the inside. In the end, the story was not about one officer, and it was not about one arrest. It was about how power reacts when it is confronted not by force, but by knowledge, not by chaos, but by clarity, and not by resistance, but by understanding. Because force can be contained, emotion can be dismissed, but systems become unstable when the people inside them begin to recognize their own contradictions.